Mark Harmon continues to take a leaf out of an NCIS character's book with new release. Mark Harmon has always understood the power of quiet evolution. For years, he embodied a character who rarely chased attention, yet commanded it effortlessly. Someone who led not by noise, but by presence. Now, with his latest creative release, Harmon seems to be stepping even further into that philosophy, blurring the line between actor and the kind of grounded wisdom his most iconic role once carried. There's something deeply intentional about the way Harmon moves through this new chapter. Unlike the loud reinventions many stars pursue after long-running television success, his approach feels almost restrained, thoughtful, patient. It's as if he's not trying to prove anything, only to continue building something meaningful. And that, perhaps, is where the echo of his past character becomes most evident. The new release, whether viewed as a creative project, a reflective work, or even a subtle reinvention, feels less like a departure and more like a continuation. Harmon isn't abandoning what made him resonate with audiences. He's refining it. The same understated strength, the same careful observation of human nature, the same sense that actions matter more than words, it's all still there, just expressed through a different medium. What makes this transition fascinating is how naturally it fits him. Many actors struggle when stepping outside the shadow of a defining role. They either run too far from it or cling too tightly. Harmon does neither. Instead, he seems to take a page, quietly, almost unconsciously, from the very character that shaped his legacy. He leans into authenticity. In this new work, there's a noticeable emphasis on reflection. Not nostalgia, but reflection. The difference matters. Nostalgia looks backward with longing. Reflection looks backward with purpose. Harmon appears more interested in understanding the journey than reliving it. That distinction gives his latest project a surprising depth, one that invites audiences not just to consume, but to consider. It also reveals something about longevity, how it isn't built on constant reinvention, but on consistency of character. The values that made him compelling on screen, integrity, resilience, quiet leadership, now seem to guide his creative decisions off-screen. It's as if he's no longer performing those traits. He's simply living them. There's a subtle boldness in that choice. In an industry that often rewards spectacle, Harmon's commitment to subtlety feels almost rebellious. He trusts the audience to meet him halfway, to appreciate nuance over noise. And remarkably, that trust pays off. His new release doesn't demand attention. It earns it. Part of what makes this evolution so compelling is the sense of continuity. Fans who followed his long-running career will recognize familiar emotional rhythms, even in a completely new format. There's a steadiness to his voice, a clarity of intention that feels unmistakably his. Yet there's also growth, a willingness to explore ideas and perspectives that might not have fit within the confines of his previous role. That balance between familiarity and exploration is difficult to achieve, but Harmon navigates it with ease. It's the same skill that once made his character such a compelling leader, knowing when to hold firm and when to adapt. And adaptation is at the heart of this new chapter. Not in a flashy, transformative sense, but in a quiet recalibration. Harmon seems to understand that growth doesn't always require dramatic change. Sometimes it's about deepening what already exists, adding layers, expanding perspective, refining purpose. There's also an emotional honesty woven throughout his latest work that feels particularly resonant. It's not overly sentimental, nor is it detached. Instead, it strikes a careful balance, acknowledging complexity without becoming overwhelmed by it. That emotional restraint, paired with genuine insight, creates a tone that feels both grounded and profound. It's easy to see why audiences continue to gravitate toward him. In a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable, there's something reassuring about a voice that values clarity and calm. Harmon doesn't offer easy answers, but he offers something perhaps more valuable: a steady presence. His new release also highlights another aspect of his enduring appeal: his ability to listen. Not literally, but creatively. There's a sense that this work isn't just about what he wants to say, but about what others might need to hear. That outward focus gives the project a sense of purpose that goes beyond personal expression. In many ways, it mirrors the ethos of the character he once portrayed. Pay attention, trust your instincts, and never underestimate the power of doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, even when it's quiet. What's particularly striking is how effortlessly Harmon carries those lessons into this new phase of his career. It doesn't feel forced or calculated. It feels earned, like the natural progression of someone who has spent decades understanding not just storytelling, but the people within those stories. And perhaps that's the real takeaway from this new release. It's not about reinvention or even legacy. It's about continuity of purpose, about staying true to the core principles that define you while still allowing room for growth. Harmon's journey reminds us that evolution doesn't have to be loud to be meaningful. It doesn't have to be dramatic to be impactful. Sometimes, the most powerful changes happen quietly, one thoughtful decision at a time. As audiences engage with his latest work, they may find themselves reflecting not just on his journey, but on their own. That's the mark of something truly resonant. It extends beyond the creator, inviting others to find meaning within it. In continuing to take a leaf out of that familiar character's book, Harmon isn't just honoring the past, he's building on it. He's showing that the qualities that once defined a role can also define a life, shaping not just what we do, but how we do it. And in doing so, he offers a quiet but powerful message: that authenticity, patience, and integrity never go out of style. What makes this next phase of Mark Harmon's journey even more compelling is the sense that he's no longer creating from a place of expectation, but from intention. There's a difference, and it shows. Expectation demands results. Intention cultivates meaning. And in this new release, meaning is everywhere, woven into the smallest details, the quietest moments, the pauses as much as the words. It's impossible to ignore how much of this mindset echoes the legacy of Leroy Jethro Gibbs from NCIS. Gibbs was never about spectacle. He was about precision, discipline, and trust. Trust in people, in instincts, in the idea that doing things the right way matters more than doing them the easy way. Harmon seems to have internalized that philosophy so deeply that it now informs how he approaches storytelling itself. In this continuation, there's a noticeable shift toward legacy, not in the sense of looking back at what's been accomplished, but in considering what's left behind. What does a lifetime of work amount to if it doesn't connect, if it doesn't resonate? Harmon appears to be asking those questions, not directly, but through the texture of his work. The result is something that feels layered, almost meditative. There's also a quiet confidence at play. Not the kind that seeks validation, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are. That confidence allows Harmon to take creative risks that might otherwise feel understated or even unconventional. He's not chasing trends. He's not trying to reinvent the wheel. He's simply refining his voice and trusting that it's enough. And perhaps that's what makes this new chapter feel so authentic. It doesn't try to be everything to everyone. Instead, it focuses on being something real, something grounded. In an entertainment landscape often dominated by excess, that restraint feels refreshing. Another layer worth exploring is the emotional continuity between Harmon and the audiences who have followed him for decades. There's a shared history there, an unspoken understanding. Viewers who spent years watching him navigate complex cases and moral dilemmas in NCIS now find themselves engaging with a different kind of narrative, one that feels more personal, yet no less impactful. That connection isn't accidental. It's built on trust. The same trust that made Gibbs such a compelling leader now shapes how Harmon communicates through his work. He doesn't over-explain. He doesn't overwhelm. He allows space for interpretation, for reflection, for the audience to meet him on their own terms. This approach also speaks to a broader truth about storytelling, that sometimes what's left unsaid carries as much weight as what's spoken. Harmon understands this instinctively. He always has. And in this new release, that understanding becomes a central strength. There's also an interesting interplay between past and present happening here. Harmon isn't distancing himself from his legacy, but he isn't confined by it either. Instead, he treats it as a foundation, a starting point from which new ideas can grow. That balance is rare, and it's what allows this project to feel both familiar and entirely new at the same time. Even the pacing of his work reflects this philosophy. It's deliberate, unhurried, confident in its rhythm. There's no rush to reach a conclusion, no urgency to deliver instant gratification. Instead, it unfolds naturally, inviting the audience to slow down and engage more deeply. And in that slowing down, something remarkable happens. The work begins to resonate on a different level. It's no longer just about entertainment. It becomes an experience. One that lingers, that prompts thought, that stays with you long after it's over. This is where Harmon's evolution becomes most apparent. He's no longer just telling stories. He's shaping them with intention, with care, with a clear sense of purpose. And that purpose feels rooted in something deeper than career ambition. It feels personal. There's also a subtle mentorship quality emerging in this phase of his career. Not in a direct instructional sense, but in the example he sets. By choosing authenticity over spectacle, depth over noise, he offers a different model for what success can look like. One that prioritizes substance over visibility. It's a reminder that influence doesn't always come from being the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes, it comes from being the most consistent, the most reliable, the most true to oneself. As this new chapter continues to unfold, it becomes increasingly clear that Harmon isn't just revisiting familiar themes, he's expanding them. Exploring new dimensions, asking new questions, challenging both himself and his audience to think more deeply. And yet, through all of this, there's a sense of calm, a steadiness that anchors everything. It's the same steadiness that once defined Gibbs, now carried forward in a different form. Not as a character, but as a philosophy. In many ways, this continuation feels less like a career move and more like a natural progression of identity. Harmon isn't stepping into something new, so much as he's revealing more of who he's always been. And that's what makes it resonate. Because at its core, this isn't just about a new release or a new direction. It's about continuity, of values, of voice, of purpose. It's about understanding that growth doesn't mean leaving everything behind. Sometimes, it means carrying the best parts forward and allowing them to evolve. In taking yet another leaf out of Gibbs's book, Harmon isn't simply honoring a role that defined a generation of television. He's demonstrating how those lessons can extend far beyond the screen. How they can shape choices, guide creativity, and ultimately, define a legacy that feels both enduring and alive. And as audiences continue to engage with this evolving narrative, one thing becomes certain. Mark Harmon's story is far from over. In fact, it may just be entering its most meaningful chapter yet. As this unfolding chapter continues, what becomes even more striking about Mark Harmon is not just the consistency of his voice, but the intentional quiet behind it. There's a sense that he's become increasingly comfortable with letting his work speak in softer tones, trusting that resonance doesn't require volume. And in that trust, there's a kind of creative freedom that many never quite reach. This freedom allows him to explore nuance in ways that feel almost intimate. The storytelling isn't just structured, it breathes. Moments stretch where they need to, reflections settle in without being rushed away, and emotions are given the space to exist without being overdefined. It's a rhythm that feels less like performance and more like conversation, one that invites the audience not just to watch, but to listen. Naturally, the shadow of Leroy Jethro Gibbs still lingers, not as a constraint, but as a quiet companion. Gibbs' influence isn't loud or overt. It's embedded in the choices Harmon makes, the patience, the restraint, the understanding that leadership, whether in a team or in storytelling, often comes down to knowing when to step forward and when to step back. That balance becomes even more important as Harmon navigates a landscape that constantly demands reinvention. Where many might feel pressure to redefine themselves dramatically, he seems to resist that pull. Instead, he refines, he sharpens, he deepens. And in doing so, he demonstrates that evolution doesn't have to be disruptive to be meaningful. There's also a growing sense of introspection woven into this phase of his work, not in a way that feels self-indulgent, but in a way that feels necessary. It's as though Harmon is not only telling stories, but also quietly examining the nature of storytelling itself, what it means, why it matters, and how it connects people across time and experience. That examination gives his latest release a reflective quality that lingers long after engagement. It encourages the audience to look inward as much as outward, to consider their own experiences through the lens of the narrative. And that kind of engagement is rare. It transforms passive viewing into active participation. At the same time, there's a subtle shift in perspective. Earlier in his career, much of the focus may have been on action, on decision-making, on moving the story forward. Now, there's a greater emphasis on understanding, on why those decisions matter, on what they reveal about character, about values, about the human condition itself. This shift doesn't slow the work down. It enriches it. It adds layers that reward attention, that invite revisiting, that offer something new with each engagement. It's storytelling that respects its audience, assuming not just interest, but insight. And perhaps that's one of Harmon's greatest strengths, his respect for the viewer. He doesn't simplify unnecessarily. He doesn't over-explain. He trusts that the audience will find meaning, will connect the dots, will bring their own perspectives into the experience. That trust mirrors the dynamic that made NCIS so enduring. It wasn't just about solving cases. It was about the people solving them. The relationships, the unspoken bonds, the quiet understanding that formed between characters and between the show and its audience. In this new chapter, Harmon seems to carry that same philosophy forward, but with an even broader scope. It's no longer confined to a team or a narrative structure. It becomes a way of engaging with storytelling as a whole. There's also an element of legacy that feels more defined now, not in a way that seeks to summarize a career, but in a way that seeks to extend it. Harmon isn't closing a chapter, he's building on it, creating something that stands alongside his past work while also carving out its own identity. That identity is grounded in authenticity, in a clear understanding of values, in a refusal to compromise depth for the sake of immediacy, and in a commitment to storytelling that feels both honest and intentional. It's worth noting how rare that combination is. In an industry often driven by speed and spectacle, taking the time to be thoughtful, to be deliberate, can feel almost countercultural. And yet, that's exactly what gives Harmon's work its strength. There's also a quiet courage in this approach, choosing subtlety in a world that rewards boldness, choosing reflection in a landscape that prioritizes momentum, choosing authenticity when imitation might be easier. These are not passive decisions. They're active commitments to a certain kind of creative integrity. And that integrity becomes the through line of this entire journey. It's what connects past and present, what bridges the gap between character and creator, what transforms a career into something more enduring. As audiences continue to engage with this evolving body of work, they may begin to notice something else as well. A sense of invitation. Not just to watch or read, but to think, to reflect, to engage on a deeper level. Harmon isn't just presenting a story. He's opening a space for dialogue, even if that dialogue happens quietly, internally. That's the hallmark of work that lasts. Not just because it entertains, but because it resonates, because it connects, because it offers something that goes beyond the surface. And in continuing to draw from the quiet wisdom of Gibbs, Harmon demonstrates that some lessons are timeless, that patience, integrity, and trust in oneself, in others, in the process, remain as relevant off-screen as they ever were on it. This isn't just a continuation of a career. It's a refinement of a philosophy, one that values depth over distraction, meaning over momentum, and authenticity above all else. And as this chapter continues to unfold, one thing feels increasingly certain. Whatever form his work takes next, it will carry that same quiet strength, that same deliberate care, that same unwavering commitment to telling stories that matter. Because in the end, that's what Mark Harmon has always done. Not just as an actor, but as a storyteller. And now, more than ever, he seems determined to do it on his own terms. As this journey moves forward, there's an almost poetic sense of alignment in how Mark Harmon continues to shape his creative identity. It's no longer just about the projects themselves. It's about the philosophy guiding them. Each choice feels deliberate, each step measured, as though he's crafting not just individual works, but a cohesive narrative about purpose, discipline, and authenticity. What stands out most in this phase is the growing clarity of that purpose. Earlier chapters of his career were defined by performance, inhabiting roles, bringing characters to life, anchoring stories with presence and precision. Now there's a shift toward authorship in a broader sense. Even when he's not explicitly writing or directing, there's a sense that he's curating meaning, deciding what stories deserve to be told, how they should be told, and why they matter. That why has become central. It's no longer enough for a story to be engaging. It needs to resonate. It needs to reflect something true, something human, something enduring. And that emphasis on truth feels deeply connected to the quiet lessons of Leroy Jethro Gibbs. Gibbs never chased easy answers. He sought the right ones. Harmon seems to be doing the same in his creative life, choosing depth over convenience, meaning over momentum. There's also an increasing sense of patience in how his work unfolds. Not just in pacing, but in development. Ideas aren't rushed to completion. They're allowed to evolve, to take shape organically. It's a process that mirrors real life more closely than traditional storytelling often does. And that authenticity becomes one of the defining strengths of his latest release. In many ways, Harmon appears to be embracing a kind of creative minimalism. Not in the sense of doing less, but in the sense of stripping away what isn't essential. The result is work that feels focused, intentional, and deeply grounded. There's no excess, no unnecessary flourish, just clarity of vision and execution. That clarity also extends to the emotional core of his storytelling. Rather than relying on dramatic peaks or overt sentimentality, he leans into subtlety. Small moments carry weight. Quiet realizations linger. The impact builds gradually, almost imperceptibly, until it settles into something lasting. This approach requires a certain level of trust, not just in the audience, but in the material itself. And Harmon seems more than willing to extend that trust. He allows his stories to breathe, to exist without constant reinforcement, confident that their meaning will emerge naturally. It's a philosophy that feels increasingly rare and increasingly valuable. At the same time, there's a quiet expansion happening beneath the surface. While the tone remains consistent, the scope of his work appears to be broadening. New themes emerge, new perspectives take shape, and there's a sense that Harmon is exploring territory that goes beyond what audiences might expect. Yet, even in this exploration, there's a strong sense of continuity. The core values remain unchanged: integrity, patience, thoughtfulness. These aren't just traits of a character or even a performer. They've become the foundation of a creative identity. And that identity feels more defined than ever. There's also something to be said about the timing of this evolution. After decades in the industry, many would choose to slow down, to step back, to reflect from a distance. Harmon, instead, seems to be leaning in, but in a way that feels sustainable, intentional, and deeply personal. He's not chasing relevance, he's embodying it. That distinction matters, especially in a landscape that often prioritizes visibility over substance. Harmon's work stands as a reminder that relevance isn't about being everywhere. It's about being meaningful where you are. It's about creating something that connects, that resonates, that endures. And that endurance is perhaps the most compelling aspect of this entire journey. Not just longevity in terms of career, but longevity in terms of impact. The kind of impact that doesn't fade with trends, that doesn't rely on immediacy, that builds slowly and steadily over time. There's also a growing sense of legacy, not as a conclusion, but as a continuation. Harmon isn't looking back to define what he's done. He's looking forward to shape what comes next. And in doing so, he's creating something that feels both rooted and evolving at the same time. This balance between past and future, between familiarity and discovery, is what gives his work its unique texture. It feels lived in, but never stagnant, reflective, but never static. There's always movement, always growth, even if it happens quietly. And perhaps that quiet growth is the most fitting reflection of everything Harmon has represented throughout his career. Not grand gestures or dramatic reinventions, but steady progression, thoughtful change, meaningful evolution. As audiences continue to engage with this new release, they may begin to notice how seamlessly these elements come together. The storytelling, the tone, the intention. They all align to create something that feels cohesive and genuine. It's not just a project, it's a statement about what it means to create with purpose, about what it means to evolve without losing oneself, about what it means to carry forward the lessons of the past while still making room for the future. And in continuing to draw from the quiet strength of NCIS and the enduring presence of Gibbs, Harmon demonstrates that some influences never fade. They simply transform. They become part of the fabric of who we are, shaping how we think, how we create, how we move forward. For Mark Harmon, that transformation feels complete. Not in the sense of being finished, but in the sense of being fully realized. He's no longer defined by any single role or moment. Instead, he's defined by a consistent, evolving commitment to authenticity and meaning. And as this chapter continues to unfold, there's a quiet anticipation in the air. Not for what he'll do next in terms of scale or spectacle, but for how he'll continue to refine this philosophy. How he'll continue to tell stories that matter in ways that feel true. Because if there's one thing that's become clear through all of this, it's that Mark Harmon isn't just continuing a legacy.